I'd like to thank all of you who kind of braved the weather tonight to come out, and then all of us watching on the live stream as well. So I'd also like to thank the State Archives for picking me and the Friends of the State Archives as part of this series. One of the things that I have to say is that many of the sources that I found is actually through the archives, and our state archivist John and I were kind of reminiscing on some things kind of earlier before the presentation. Right, so kind of the cover, title page. Interesting story about the cover. It's actually kind of the one thing that's not part of Missouri in this instance, and it's from Harper's Weekly, which conveniently the images don't have copyrights attached to them anymore. And it's the prayer at Sumter is the image that it's called. It's a image of prayers on kind of the eve of the Battle of Fort Sumter that were essentially published for northern audiences. My publisher, Oxford University Press, was really wonderful about a lot of things, but one of the folks who was in charge of helping come up with the cover art sends me an image, and it's of a Catholic priest saying Mass for a New York regiment. Really isn't going to work with Missouri, especially since another book had kind of used the same image a couple years before. So I was able to find this image, and even though it's not kind of a Missouri thing, I think it works really well in kind of relating the strife and the tensions over African American slavery, the schisms, and the importance of theology and religion to the Civil War. So where I start my book is with a brief story concerning the Civil War. And some of you might know this figure, Mary Easton Sibley, who with her husband George helped found Lindenwood College in St. Charles. So with Sibley, at this point, when the war starts, her husband is kind of very ill. He's significantly older than she was to begin with. He dies in 1863. And very much she exerts kind of the force and authority that she had in the Presbyterian community in St. Charles and in the area. Essentially, the focus of my work and why I chose Missouri as the focus for it is it really shows us the importance of individual congregations, individual evangelicals, and the role that individuals played here in the Civil War. A lot of what you see in kind of a lot of the history work on religion consisted primarily of stories that would kind of talk about the ministers, talk about national denominations, national bodies. That's all interesting. I mean, I'm not bashing my fellow historians, but I think as those of us who are from Missouri, live here, are very interested in Missouri history, we know that sometimes our state is the one that kind of gets forgotten about and all that, right? And looking at these schisms from the perspective of Missourians allows me to get at the congregations themselves, men, women, the ministers and leaders, of course, but the ordinary folks who donated the money, African Americans who formed their own congregations, and all kind of served to further the gospel. Now back to Mary Easton Sibley. One of the things that she and many evangelicals have to deal with in Missouri is the fact that once the Civil War starts, not everybody's on the same side. I mean, and I think, we kind of know that. In her case, she was anti-slavery. She's a staunch unionist and is quite upset at the fact that the local minister, a guy named Robert Ferris, who I couldn't find a picture of, I do apologize for that, he's not so pro-union. In fact, he's from St. Louis, kind of lives in Illinois for a while, but comes back to Missouri and kind of shows his true colors, especially during the war. She writes the provost marshal at one point that, quote, Ferris prayed that the invaders be driven out of Missouri and called for resistance to oppression. So some of you may be aware that during wartime in Missouri, you have the provost marshals, Union military officers that helped police the population. She wrote this in several letters to the local provost marshal, asking him, in fact, to remove Ferris from his pulpit and send them somewhere else. Send them south, send them to Illinois, don't send them to Missouri. Another individual in the community was a little more blunt as well and said that Ferris, quote, prayed for Jeff Davis and the Southern Confederacy, and was apparently regularly doing this in Sunday services. The provost marshal sprang into action, and Ferris soon found himself as an occupant of the Gratiot Street prison in St. Louis. It was actually kind of located around Busch Stadium where the Purina plant is now. But Ferris has his own allies in all of this. And he soon reaches out to some of his friends. So when he was in Illinois, he got to know David Davis, at this point Supreme Court Justice. And Davis and some of his allies essentially pressed the Lincoln administration to release Ferris, which they eventually do, and he returns to Missouri. That upset a lot of other people as well. One of the provost marshals is a man named Franklin Archibald Dick. He is an ally of the Blair family. Some of you might be familiar with Frank and Montgomery Blair. Frank was a congressman. Montgomery was Lincoln's postmaster general. Their family had the Blair House, which is across the street from the White House. And they're trying to use their influence to press to get Ferris back in jail. To that point, Provost Marshal Dick remarks that Ferris is one of the most impudent, persistent, and ignominious rebels in the state, and as a minister he has wielded a powerful influence in the rebellion. And then he was a little more blunt after that. For God's sake, don't let him return to Missouri. Back to Sibley and Ferris. Again, he was returned. Sibley remarks, kind of in the aftermath of all this, that the policy of sending disloyal and disaffected ministers south had been sooner adapted, that there would be less disturbances in the United States had there been, therefore, the case. The idea here is that we see that both Ferris and Sibley, along with a host of others, are on different sides of the issue during the Civil War. That for these individuals and these communities, what's going on comes to the very heart of their faith, their religion, and their conception of the Union and Missouri during the Civil War. You have folks that ultimately reject the idea of the United States. They ally themselves with the Confederacy, maybe not always in the open, but they're there nonetheless, and as Provost Marshal Dick said, can exert a massive influence in society. On the other hand, you have folks like Sibley that are fighting against this. The reason that I use this vignette as kind of the introduction to my book is it shows us a lot of the different facets that are going on here. It's not just the ministers that are playing a role. It's church leaders like Sibley, women as well as men. You have folks in the state, in the government, that are playing their role there. And it helps us to see, too, again, how important these things can be on the local level. Now, for Ferris, he fared fairly well as too. He ends up as the editor of the St. Louis Presbyterian. He's also the clerk for what becomes the Southern Presbyterian Assembly. So major figure in that church as well. And finally, we see also how these things kind of continue into Reconstruction and beyond. For Missouri, it's a state that settled gradually starting in the 1790s and into the 19th century by whites and others, African Americans that are brought in slavery, free blacks as well. This, as I call it, geography of contention allows the differences in both of the North and the South, different theologies that will ultimately spring up over the morality of slavery to flourish and grow up. For many Missouri Baptists, they form rural churches that are oftentimes held within the bounds of people's houses, maybe schoolhouses, small buildings. A lot of times they're getting their ministers from their local communities. But these folks that form these congregations have a lot of thinking that they do on the major theological issues of the day. For one of the leading pioneers in this is John Mason Peck. He kind of ends up in Illinois, but he founds a number of congregations in Missouri. His memoirs kind of extensively write about what he's doing. And he also is somebody who's extensively memorialized by the Baptists that he helped found. For many of the congregations that he found, they are in many ways typical Missouri religious rural congregations. Many of them are composed of folks that don't question slavery. Many of them will essentially be fine when the Southern Baptist Church is formed in the 1840s, essentially sending their money there. They're independent congregations as well. But at the same time, even though there's rural whites who form these churches, there's also a significant religious presence by African Americans in Missouri. Some of you might be familiar with John Barry Meacham, who starts out as a barrel maker, eventually goes into the Baptist ministry. Peck immediately kind of sees the guy has a great deal of talent. Peck, who is fairly anti-slavery, he kind of keeps it to himself, helps Meacham establish his own congregation, the First African Baptist Church in St. Louis. Meacham does a number of things, but also is very active in the community, active with education. But he also has to function in the slave society of 19th century Missouri too, which limits what he can do. One of the, as you saw in my introduction, the three major denominations are the Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians. Presbyterian ministers would make their way into Missouri too. Much like the Baptists and Methodists, they would plant churches, institutions, and colleges in the early decades of the 19th century. One of these colleges is the Marion College in Marion County in northeast Missouri. I kind of added on the map here the little arrows pointing out where the college is in an 1840s image, and also Ely, Missouri is where another branch of the college was as well. The founder of the college was a Presbyterian doctor turned minister, David Nelson. He had hoped to get a manual labor school going in Missouri where students could come, work the farm for about 3 hours a day, and thus pay for their education. There's various estimates on how big the college was. It probably was no more than 100 students at its height. But for a time at least, it was fairly successful. Added to that, he's also able to recruit a number of Northeastern financial and theological backers as well. The noted minister Ezra Stiles Ely is one of these folks, and he even comes to Missouri from the Northeast to teach at the college for a while. But where our kind of contention and different views on things come into being is with this college. Well, most schools would love to recruit folks from out of state, out of the area. The folks that are kind of living around it are kind of a little apprehensive at the fact that the majority of the students are not from Missouri. They're from states like Ohio and Massachusetts and Vermont and other places like that. For ministers like Nelson, they are beginning to embrace a very much anti-slavery theology. They view Missouri as a state that would be better off as a free state. They have folks that they're recruiting both financially and in person to come to the college to support just that idea. But for Missouri Presbyterians in the rest of the state, the fact that the makeup of their college is this way is kind of problematic to them. They want it to be a Missouri institution where folks from St. Louis, Central Missouri, and other places can go. I mean, they don't mind if folks from other states come, but they very much want those folks to be aligned with the various values that they see in place, which are not the values of kind of the anti-slavery theology that Nelson is bringing in. Ultimately, Nelson is removed from the presidency, told, go somewhere else. He ministers for a while nonetheless, but ultimately runs into problems. read the quote. At one point, after Nelson's preaching, where he specifically says Missouri would be better off as an anti-slavery state, and quotes various passages from the Bible and preaches on that point, according to one of his friends, all the friends of slavery threw to arms. Many expressed the determination that Dr. Nelson should not leave the state a living man. He then had to make his way back to Illinois, overland. It took him about 3 days, but he made it. And he also made it into the papers. The Missouri Argus, a paper in St. Louis, which was aligned with Andrew Jackson and the Democratic Party, said as follows, after Nelson's imbroglio. It will teach abolitionists apologize, I can't see the PowerPoint, who insist upon the liberation of our slaves, regardless of the awful consequences which most inevitably result to the whites, that it is decidedly the best and safest way to attend to their own affairs and to allow the wicked slaveholders, as they come to call us, to get along as we may. Shortly thereafter, the Presbyterians split into old and new school factions. The new school factions come about with different theological ideas, but many that are animated in an anti-slavery activism. Ideas that the Old South folk, or the old school, reject as, for those in the South, not Southern, and in other cases, too activist for their interpretation. Finally, the Methodists undergo a similar split. In this case, over the institution theology of slavery. They split into a Methodist Episcopal Church and a Methodist Episcopal Church South. Now, if you're to read my book, you can go through all the details of the national schism too. But again, I'm focused on Missouri and kind of focused on local things. So, as this is happening on the national level and making its way into the local level, many evangelicals in St. Louis, central Missouri, northeastern Missouri, southern Missouri, have to figure out how they're going to side in all this. For many, they had been in particular churches for a while. Their relatives, their families, their kinship networks were there as well. And in some cases, they have to go against these folks. Consider the case of Mary Kingston Tabor, who's in St. Louis and a member of the 4th Street Methodist Church there. For her and her husband, they had a great deal of money invested in the church that they have to withdraw in this case. For Mary Kingston Tabor, this is especially problematic because some of the other members of that congregation are in fact her nieces and her cousins, folks that they had close relationships with, but essentially reject the idea of the theology of slavery that this new Methodist Episcopal Church South is forming. Moreover, too, her husband, Joseph, who had at one point been a minister but kind of essentially withdrew from the active ministry to oversee an occupation, was starting to get active in the church. Eventually, the Tabors would help form the Ebenezer Memorial Chapel in St. Louis and split off of their 4th Street church that they had been in for a good long while. On the other hand, her nephews, in this case John and William Finney, a couple of merchants in St. Louis, would continue to back the 4th Street Methodist Church and would get increasingly aggressive in doing so. So for many of these evangelicals, the property that they had invested dear money in, their time and their energy, and remember this is the 19th century, they don't have near as much money to throw away as all of us do. These become a big deal because ultimately they see these as tools for evangelization of the gospel. So this brings us to another big theme that I look at, church property litigation. So for these evangelicals, ultimately they're not able to settle these disputes. Their churches are breaking apart. So ultimately, they have to turn to the state in order to figure this out. So I'd like you to consider the case of the African Methodist Episcopal Church in St. Louis, which was originally part of the white 4th Street congregation and gradually formed their own church in the 1820s. Their property at the time was on Green Street in St. Louis. Wasn't too far from where the Rams used to play in the city. So for the founders of this congregation, Jonathan Duncan and James Farrar, they worked tirelessly to get the congregation going. In their case, they're both freedmen, but they were both born into slavery. But they both operate as exhorters, which in the Methodist rules and discipline of the time allows them to preach to the congregation. So they're not ministers, but they're allowed to preach. The church itself forms up its own set of trustees, Farrar along with a gentleman named Lewis Jones and another named Ralph Harrison. So in every aspect of their existence, this church on Green Street was an independent congregation. But the 1840s hit, the schisms hits, and folks like the Finney brothers who ran the 4th Street Church tell the folks who run the African Methodist Episcopal Church that you guys need to side with the Southern Methodist Church. The congregation rejected it by a vote of a little over 100 to 13, rather decisively. But the Finneys weren't going to stop there. They take the congregation to court. Essentially, the 4th Street Church claims that this is not an independent congregation. The property is theirs. The town lots at this point are very expensive in a major city. And the litigation makes its way all the way up to the Missouri State Supreme Court. Some of you that are a little familiar with the litigation surrounding the Dred Scott case might recognize some of these judges. On the left there is the vehemently pro-slavery Judge William Scott, who wrote the state-level decision in the Dred Scott case, basically striking down Dred Scott's slave freedom suit. Ebia Leonard is on the court, as well as John Ferguson Ryland, who also concurs with Scott in that infamous decision. For the trustees of the Green Street Church, this African Methodist Episcopal Church, they are willing to see this lawsuit through. But unfortunately, the court is able to find a technicality to dismiss it on, instead of weighing the case of the Green Street trustees, which based on the laws of the time should have ruled in their favor. But we know, of course, the prejudices of the Missouri courts in this era that weren't going to most likely grant them a fair case. What it stems on is that there's something called the Bill of Exceptions, kind of the things that in this case, the lawyers for the Green Street Church object to. It wasn't signed on time by the lower court in St. Louis. Normally, what just generally happened in that instance is that the other side would consent for it to go forward. In this case, the lawyers for the 4th Street Church, the white church, refused to do so, and the court rejected the appeal essentially on technical grounds. So Ryland here says, reluctant as this court is to see the causes pass off on other grounds than such as to settle the merits of the controversy, either in faith or law, yet we deem it of the highest importance to the community of large that there would be a uniformity in the sessions in regard to matters of practice. You know, we're not going to change the rules, and we'll dismiss the case of technicality. Now, for the trustees of the African Methodist Church, they eventually found another building, kind of rebuilt their congregation, and it continued to grow, showing kind of the determination of this group. But as we move into the Civil War, these different ideas on theology, different ideas on the law continue to play up in Missouri. Consider the pastor of the Second Baptist Church in St. Louis, a man named Galusha Anderson. During the Civil War, he preaches the following at one point: "Brethren, we have no need, no fears to the ultimate issue. The Lord God only potent reigneth. In this conflict, your property may be swept away, and all may be reduced to a common level. Your life and mine may be sacrificed on the altar of our country. Yet Jehovah, who presides over the scene, will bring the nation forth from the ordeal wiser, purer, and nobler. These ideas over the schisms in the antebellum era turn into a full-on pro-union, anti-slavery theology during the war. Men like Anderson preach these ideas from their pulpit. In the newspapers, they're joined by men such as Charles Eliot, who's the editor of the Central Christian Advocate, the Methodist paper for Missouri and the surrounding regions. And Eliot says, in regard to the destruction of the war, let us just note that the retribution of heaven here. Missouri, in her days of border ruffian, invaded Kansas and instigated the men of Cottondom. Now these disturbers of the peace have left her to her fate, to suffer tenfold all Kansas ever suffered. For the folks on the northern side, the pro-union side, their theologies continue not only through the war and after the war. Some of you may be familiar with the Missouri State Constitution of 1865. Within it was a somewhat infamous test oath that contained 85 provisions that the swearer would have to take to swear that they never supported the Confederacy during the war. It's an interesting document of legalese and something that's honestly a little hard for me to read even. But the leader was a gentleman named Charles Drake, who was a St. Louis Presbyterian, an active, they call the trustees ruling elders at this point in the Presbyterian Church, and leader of the Radical Union Party in Missouri, which was generally aligned with the radical Republican wing of the National Party. Within the Constitution kind of contains the following phrase, that no person shall be deemed a qualified voter who has ever been in armed hostility to the United States or to the lawful authorities thereof, or been in the service of the so-called Confederate States of America. Nor shall any person be capable of holding in the state any office of honor, trust, or profit under its authority, or of being an officer, councilman, director, trustee, or other manager of any corporation, public or private, now existing or hereafter established by its authorities, or acting as a professor or a teacher in any educational institution, or in any common or other school, or of holding any real estate or any other property in trust for the use of any church, religious society, or congregation. So, in essence, anybody who refused the test oath, here's the long list of things you couldn't do. And the Constitution spells it out in more detail. I kind of saved you the pain of having to go through that. But on the part of Drake and the other radical unionists, plus folks like the aforementioned Galusha Anderson or Charles Eliot, their congregants, folks like Mary Easton Sibley that supported these methods, these ideas, this is purposeful. The notion is to ensure that the folks that supported the Confederacy, the folks that hold to this Southern theology, can't do anything really in the state of Missouri. It's in essence to push them out. And the oaths are designed in what's called a retrospective sense, where you not only have to swear to be good in the future, but you, as you can see, have to promise to have been good in the past. If you supported the Confederacy ever, you can't take this in good conscience. One of the themes that we see here is the fact that both pro-Northern, pro-Southern, anti-slavery, pro-slavery evangelicals engage in a print war, so to speak, about their various issues. We saw a segment of that with the Central Christian Advocate, another Methodist minister aligned with the Southern Church, in this case William Lefwich, writes a book in 1870 entitled Martyrdom in Missouri. There are 2 volumes of it, too. And what he does is he goes through and basically chronicles every instance where a Southern-leaning, kind of pro-slavery-leaning minister or congregation is essentially gone after by the Union authorities. In some instances, he maybe is prone to trusting his sources a little too much. In other instances, stuff's backed up by the Provost Marshal papers. But for many evangelicals in Missouri, this test oath goes too far. The Missouri Baptists, their General Association, resolves the following: that the state has no right to interfere with the freedom of conscience, the relations of the ministry to their congregations, and to the absolute liberty of the churches in all matters of faith, worship, and discipline. For these principles they have suffered in every country. We cannot therefore but express sorrow that the new Constitution of the state of Missouri requires our ministry a certain oath before they can lawfully discharge the duties of their sacred office. In the 1867 case, Cummings v. Missouri, essentially the Supreme Court strikes down the test oath. In this case, it's a Catholic priest from Louisiana, Missouri, Father Joseph Cummings, refuses the oath. The case kind of moves its way up the Missouri courts, and ultimately the Supreme Court, by a single vote, strikes down the test oath. Their argument in this instance is that the oath is such a thing that while it would work fine in wartime, Reconstruction is no longer wartime. So the oath essentially needs to be struck out. That emergency of the Civil War no longer exists in their estimation. But for religious folks in Missouri, Reconstruction also kind of brings them a reorientation in their churches, as these theological ideas on the conception of the Union, the role of what had been slavery and such, continue to take place. So I'll kind of conclude with a final set of religious splits, in this case concerning the African American congregations in Missouri. So we saw earlier, folks like John Berry Meacham were able to control their own churches, folks like the African Methodist Episcopal Church in St. Louis. But for many folks that are throughout Missouri, many African Americans, they're often in white congregations. What happens after the Civil War is that these congregations begin to rapidly grow. In some cases, black congregants report that they're being kind of forced out of or encouraged out of their congregations. In other cases, they simply leave and form their own churches. Typical of the white congregations that are losing members this way, we see the New Salem Baptist Church, that we believe it to be the religious interest of the church for the colored members to be organized as a separate body. Therefore, resolve that we hereby detach them from us and enroll them in a separate church book. But for many of the individual congregants, like a gentleman, William Black, who's out of Hannibal, they take a great deal of pride in what they're able to build up after the Civil War. This includes purchasing and constructing their own buildings, undertaking their own evangelical efforts. Black Baptists in Missouri and beyond form their own associations and begin to cooperate on a state and also national level. The idea here is, even though I kind of conclude my research with Reconstruction, many of the ideas here kind of continue in the decades later in the 19th century and after the Civil War. But as we can see here, and we can see throughout this, and hopefully makes a little more sense to you after tonight, that individual men and women who are participating in these churches in Missouri not only have a big stake in it, but also see these theological issues as important, and it also ensures about how they relate to everything else in the world. So not only in this case just their churches and their congregations, but how they view and practice and things in the Civil War, their interactions with the state, and essentially the efforts that they have in shaping what they see as an ideal version of Missouri.